Hi, and welcome back for another episode of Forage Focus. My name's Christine Gelley. I work for OSU Extension in Noble County, Ohio, and I'm happy to be here on the show with a special guest who's been a frequent guest here lately, Dr. Brady Campbell. Brady, would you please introduce yourself again to our audience?
Yeah, of course, Christine. My name is Brady Campbell, and I'm assistant professor in the Department of Animal Sciences here at The Ohio State University, where I serve as the state small ruminant extension specialist.
We've had a nice October here so far this year, and part of the thrill of October for me was being able to attend Ohio Sheep Day. We were able to put in some forage demonstration plots, and that's what we're going to highlight today for you on the show. Brady, would you like to explain a bit about what our goals were with the demonstration plots and what Ohio Sheep Day is?
Yeah, certainly. We'll kind of start with the event itself. Ohio Sheep Day is traditionally held in July, kind of the peak of the summer there. And we understand that in years past, we've had some varying variances in attendance due to both, people out in the fields getting some hay done, other commitments such as vacations across the summer, and also the intense heat. So for our planning committee here this year, we decided to change things up a bit and bring it back for us into the fall. Ohio Sheep Day is traditionally held for any shepherds throughout the state. And of course, some of our neighboring states, we do get attendance from those folks as well. And it's just really an educational opportunity for our producers to come, meet, gather, and talk to some of our researchers. Recently, it's been our mission to further connect our researchers here in the Department of Animal Sciences with those people that need it the most. And that's going to be our producers or our extension agents, of course, being the boots on the ground, getting the information that we are providing, creating, and identifying through our research projects and putting it to use on farm. What was unique about Sheep Day this year is that we had the opportunity to have the ability to reseed some of our fields at the ORDC small ruminant unit up here in Wooster, Ohio. And so instead of allowing those fields lay fallow across the fall and winter here, we decided to jump on the opportunity and plant several varieties and types and kinds of annual forages that can be used in our grazing systems. And although if you don't have a grazing system, we know the benefits of cover crops in our cropping systems as well.
And we had a wide variety of things planted out there. We do want to give a shout out to Merit Seed of Berlin, Ohio. They donated the seed that was used in the plots, and everything did really well as far as germination. And so we thank them greatly for their support. Brady, there are some terms we're going to be using as we discuss the different forages planted and their value for our livestock that some folks might not be familiar with. We were able to send all of the forages to Rock River Laboratories to have them analyzed, and we were able to take that analysis and put it into a nice, easy to read sheet for all the participants at Sheep Day. What are some of the terms that we used on that sheet so that our viewers can better understand?
Right. When we talk about feed sources, Christine, one of the biggest questions that producers commonly ask is crude protein, or what is the protein percentage in our feed? That's one way, or the major way, that a lot of our feedstuffs are marketed in the commodity industry. And it makes sense because it's the most expensive proportion of that diet, typically, or the most expensive ingredient within that diet. So I think it's important that we need to take a look at crude protein, which is going to be abbreviated as CP, or crude protein percentages. And then also, since we're talking about forages, we need to understand their fiber values, and we can analyze those in two different ways as we have two different methods for it. The first of which you'll see the acronym of ADF, which stands for acid detergent fiber. And this really consists of the indigestible proportions of forages, primarily those that are cellulose and lignin, those that are non-digestible by our microbiome. And then the other is going to be NDF, which describes our neutral detergent fiber values. And these are going to be structural components of the plant itself. It's going to include both the cellulose and lignin from the ADF value, but also in addition to hemicellulose as well. It should be noted as well that these forage samples were analyzed on a dry matter basis. So that means once they were sent to the laboratory, they were dried down to get a percent of dry matter within the sample. That's also going to be on the quality sample sheet as well.
At this point, we're going to take a virtual walk through the demonstration plots, and we'll take you one by one through the list of what was planted, show you what the crops looked like, and talk a little bit about each one. Our first plot is a brassica, and that was purple top turnips. Brady and I have also done some research on purple top turnips in lambing systems down here in Noble County. Brady, what did we see in those plots, and what are some tips for people who may use purple top turnips?
Sure, in the study, Christine, that we've got published and just recently put a nice summary review on the OSU Sheep Team homepage there if you're interested in learning more details about it. But what we did is we took fall lambing ewes, we lambed them out there in September, and our goal was to get those lambs grazing throughout that end of fall into the winter to create this fall winter grazing system. We had 3 different forage varieties, and one of those forage varieties was purple top turnips. The other 2 were stockpile pasture, again, primarily that tall fescue that we see here in the eastern and southern part of the state of Ohio. And then that third treatment group was going to be a stand of oats. When we evaluated that data, we saw that those fall-born lambs that were grazing again during November all the way to December 31st had the highest rate of gain of about a half a pound a day, which was pretty significant given the conditions that they were under.
Absolutely. Those purple top turnips would be considered a winter annual in most situations in Ohio, although they can be grown in the spring, but they prefer those cooler temperatures, and so that's ideal as either a cover crop or something to fill your forage gap if you're a little low on pasture or trying to save your stockpiled tall fescue. That's a nice in-betweener crop that you can use.
You bet. And this forage here as well, Christina, is relatively cheap. It's the same variety that you be planting in your own garden as well. I'll make the caveat here that all the data that you see on this sheet that will be continuously popping up to take a look at these quality parameters reflect that of the leaf material or leaf matter, that green fleshy material. As you know, the purple top turnips are going to have that tuber or that bulb down in the ground that's high in starch. However, when we analyze these forages, again, we were just taking leaf material and none of the bulbs or tubers that were associated with them.
There are some crops that with a root system on them can be consumed, but usually that's going to be done by adult use. Other animals may eat the entire plant as well. Cattle like to pull turnips out of the ground and eat the whole thing, but if we're talking about small animals, they typically will just eat the tops off and leave that root material under. It's beneficial though because we get regrowth then off that root material. We're going to see another one here in a bit with a substantial root, but let's move on to our next plot. This one is crimson clover. Crimson clover is an annual clover species. It can again be used as a winter annual or a summer annual, but in most cases is a winter annual in Ohio with growth in the fall and then a little growth again in the spring where it will flower. Crimson clover has a really pretty purple reddish bloom on top. It's very attractive to pollinators. It's also very tasty. And we can see that it's got pretty good nutritional value here. And it's one of those ones you're going to want to make sure has been inoculated when you plant it so you get that nitrogen fixation in the soil. The next following crop is going to use that nitrogen as a boost both for early spring growth and maybe later on as well. And so if you're looking to save a little bit on nitrogen fertilizer, which we know is very expensive, utilizing a legume in the crop prior to a high nitrogen user, such as any type of the small grains or grass species, can give you a jump start on the next season.
Christine, I'll make a note that even though we weren't doing a preferential grazing study with our ewes that we had out on pasture, the crimson clover there was one of the first forages that they were hitting as soon as they moved to their next forage area that they were allotted.
Our next forage is a forage brassica called Winifred. What's special about Winnie?
Yeah, with the Winifred forage brassica, Christine, a unique brassica itself, it does not have a tuber or a bulb associated with it. So a lot of the energy that this plant is using is going to go to that stem and leaf material. Certainly out of all of our brassicas that we had growing in our system here, it had the biggest leaf area and was one of the higher yielding varieties. Now we can only say it was higher yielding variety of brassica due to visual appearance. Of course, we didn't take dry matter samples or yield samples with these forages. However, if we had the ability to do so in the future, we'll certainly provide that information at a later date.
Our next plot is one that a lot of people are unfamiliar with. This variety is called hunter rape, and rape is a brassica crop. It's very similar to canola. And so many plants that are in the brassica family are considered either a rape or a canola of some type. And that's just one of the classifications of this specific brassica. It can be used in a lot of ways. Again, a winter annual in this case. And it has a lot of top growth as well, very little root growth. So again, most of the energy is going to be allocated to that leaf material, giving you the highest quality material on top for your animals to eat. In our next plot, we have daikon radishes. This is another one with a significant root.
Yeah, and again, this is kind of a radish that we have the ability to eat as well. It has a nice tuber or a root to it, very long and cylindrical, and you'll see an image pop up of it as well. Similar feed quality as our other forage brassicas that we have out there. And as you walk through the field and you kind of snap some of the stems, Christine, I'd say that the radish is one of the more potent or pungent type of smells as we take a look at those forages as we walk through the paddocks.
This is one that may be concerning if you have dairy animals. We don't have very many dairy sheep producers, but if you are a cattle producer happening to watch this episode, there can be some off-flavored milk going with some of the brassicas on occasion. This may be one with some off-flavored milk. So it'd be ideal to keep your lactating animals off of the daikon radish, just assuming that there could be some carryover there. But for other classes of livestock, should be perfectly fine for consumption.
And Christine, that's our last brassica that we have to demonstrate throughout our forage plots. So a really quick caveat of our brassicas, we typically don't see these as pure forage swords or pure stands throughout our paddocks. It's typically mixed with something else. And I think what we need to highlight here is our NDF values. You can see that our NDF values are extremely low, so low that we have some issues with loose stool or diarrhea in our animals that we have out there grazing. So their passage rate is quite quick and quite fast. So the ability for them to really digest those feeds potentially decreases. So this may be the opportunity where we incorporate some more grasses or some small grains into their diet in terms of forages, I should say, to have a bit more fiber value in there to slow down the passage and perhaps improve the digestibility. Or I know everybody has it. We have poor quality hay. It's made every year, whether we try to or not. So maybe this is a potential area where we can set some of that poor quality hay out in our fields to be able to utilize that to our benefit in our systems.
The timing is perfect for animals that are either have just become pregnant or in the breeding season. It's for you to use up that lower quality forage you have on hand and save the good stuff for later, late gestation and lactation periods. So don't waste the good stuff. Use the bad stuff while you're grazing your brassicas. Moving into our next plot, we have everleaf oats. Oats are a very versatile small grain. They can be used for grain production. They can also be baled as forage, and they can be grazed as well, or just left on as a cover crop. There's various varieties of oats. Some of them will winter kill, others will not. In a lot of grazing systems, this is a good place to use those that would winter kill, give you some good fall grazing, and then be a clean slate to go in the spring with whatever you want to plant next. Oats retain their nutritive value pretty well even after a killing frost, and that's one of the benefits. They're a very high crude protein grass. So our small grains are also in the grass family, but we typically think of them as grains rather than grasses. And so our oats can be highly beneficial. They have adequate fiber, they have excellent crude protein, and making sure that we fertilize them adequately is going to improve our crude protein values. So adding some of that starter nitrogen, like we described, will be beneficial in the system, or to use them to follow a legume crop. They could pull the nitrogen left behind in that system as well, turn it into nutrients for your animals.
Christine, as we walk through the forage plots, we noticed that in some of our grasses and small grains had some red or yellow and orange spots on those leaves. Could you kind of explain what was happening with those forages?
And sure, that's quite common in a lot of varieties of grasses. That's a fungus called rust. And rust gives it a rusty appearance with a red to orange hue. And those are actual fungal fruiting structures that you're seeing on the leaves. That fungus does decrease nutritive value slightly. It does reduce the ability of the plant to continue to put out nice, fresh leaf material, but it is no harm to livestock or to you. Rust is not harmful if consumed by the animals, and so it's Usually not a concern in a grazing system, but would be more concerning for those that are using oats as a grain crop. But seeing a little bit of rust is not to worry. Typically, a fungicide is not needed if you're using this as livestock feed. In our next plot, this is one I can get lost in, our sorghum Sudan grass. Brady, what are some benefits and challenges associated with sorghum Sudan?
I think we can start with the challenges, Christine, and quite literally, you could have gotten lost in this paddock as we had it planted throughout the field. We had a really nice dense stand, and our forages were well over 6 foot tall. What's really nice about this specific variety, the Hay King sorghum Sudan grass, is that it's thin stalked, and so that had the ability to be consumed a bit better by our sheep. And of course, as these forages mature over time, they're going to have a thicker stalk. They may have some more lignin just simply to help hold that plant structure up. And of course, we'll have a decrease in overall intake and nutritive value with that forage crop. But if we get to it pretty young, it can be a really high quality, highly digestible feed for our animals.
It can also be used as a silage crop if you get into the habit of making silage. It's a good candidate. Could be a substitute for corn silage if you didn't have enough time to grow corn, but had enough time for sorghum Sudan. Could be used in that application. We should note that sorghum Sudan grass is a summer annual, and there was enough time with an August planting to get good grazing in on that before we get a killing frost. If you are grazing warm season grasses, and a lot of other grasses as well, there is some concern after first frost with prussic acid poisoning, as well as nitrates. You can have accumulation of nitrates in a plant after a period of drought or over fertilization that can onset after frost, where the nitrogen can't dissipate throughout the plant. Typically, poisonings are not very common, but can occur, and when they do, can be quite detrimental. So if you have animals grazing at a time when killing frost is expected, pull those animals off, leave the stand for about a week, and then you can turn the animals back in to graze the residue after those acids have dissipated throughout the plant. In our next plot, we have one that's pretty unfamiliar to most livestock producers, Egyptian wheat. It is considered wheat, but it actually looks more like corn when it's growing out in the field. Egyptian wheat is commonly grown for bird enthusiasts. Dove hunters really like Egyptian wheat because the grain that grows on it is very attractive to birds. But the forage can also be grazed by ruminant livestock. It's again very tall growing. It can accumulate fiber quickly later in the growing season. Another warm season grass can be utilized as a cover crop, can be chopped for silage, or just grazed in the field. In our next plot, we have Austrian winter pea. It's another one typically grown in a mix, but we had pure stand here in our demo plots. Brady, tell us some about this one.
Yeah, Christine, and this is certainly a forage that we wish we would have had something else growing with it. Unfortunately, we had some weed pressure as we got later into the season, and the lack of these forages being able to take over here. But the winter pea was really of high value, had a moderate crude protein when we compare it to the rest of the list. A really nice forage for it in itself. A legume, again, we talked about the nitrogen fixation, the importance of that for our soil health, and also being able to provide a nice amount of protein to our animals. What's really nice about that Austrian winter pea is it's got the little tendrils as you would see on some pole beans if you were growing them in your garden. So if you were going to plant this, we'd encourage you to plant it along with some taller growing forages so it has its ability to grow up throughout that canopy. It was funny, Christine, during the Sheep Day event, we had many folks, due to the persuasion of Dr. Tony Parker, people were kind of taking some buffet options throughout our forages here, and the winter pea was quite a popular option. Taking some of that leafy green material, and it tastes just like a pea.
It is quite delicious. If you're into those sugar snap peas, Austrian winter peas, good for you too. Can be out there grazing with your livestock also. In our next plot, we have one called triticale. You may also hear it called triticale. Both are acceptable, whichever way you choose. Triticale is a cross between wheat and rye, and this has been a popular forage. It's a small grain. It makes great grazing material. It can also be wet wrapped as hay. It does have some issues drying down, but another excellent winter annual that can be used in a grazing system. The next plot, this is one I've only seen in my area planted for pollinators. It's been very popular for pollinators, but that's not all it's good for. This one is buckwheat.
Yeah, buckwheat. And down in my neck of the woods, I'm a bit further south than you, Christine. Buckwheat's quite popular in my area for our deer hunters, or a nice cover crop as well. Buckwheat's one of those plants that is considered a small grain as well, because it's going to produce some sort of seed to it. I know down in West Virginia, they've got festivals where they make pancakes and flour and any other type of material out of those seeds. But in our instances, we were trying to make this a grazing scenario. What's really nice about buckwheat is that it has a short growth period, that it can mature about 30 to 40 days. So if you have an area that you want to get planted, you want to get established and get covered, and you have a limited amount of time, buckwheat may be the solution for you.
So,
Unfortunately, Christine, due to the way that we planted all of these forages, they were at the same day of age in terms of growth. So when we were evaluating and looking at this buckwheat, it was indeed 60 days. So therefore, it had already gone through the flowering process and it had already developed seed. So it was kind of heading out the door for us in terms of forage and feed quality. But nonetheless, if we had the ability to get in there and graze on it a little bit sooner in its immature stages, it would have been perfect for our scenario.
yeah, and likely what we'll see is that in that plot, we may have some volunteer buckwheat in the following growing season with that seed being deposited. Now, after talking about that buckwheat, I want some pancakes with some honey on top. But let's move on talking about soybeans. In our next plot, we have a forage soybean planted. This variety is called Eagle Large Lad. And if you didn't know, soybeans were originally grown in the United States as a grazing crop, as forage, rather than as a grain crop. And so some varieties are still out there that can be utilized primarily for grazing. And the benefit of a grazing type or a forage type soybean is that there's going to be a lot more energy allocation to leaves rather than to pods and the set of seed. And so really it's ideal that we want to get our soybeans either grazed or harvested before oil accumulation starts in the soybean. So you can start to see pod development and that's fine. But once seed fill really starts, we're getting past the ideal stage to graze or harvest soybeans for animal consumption. You can ensile soybeans. One of the challenges with them is they're a bit hard to harvest. They like to get tangled in equipment. And the best way to store them as silage is usually in a bag. But they're adequate for grazing. Animals love them. In most cases, a lot of people plant them as a deer crop, can also be useful for cattle, sheep, and goats.
Christina, as you noted, big leaves on these as we look through those paddocks. Again, ours had a lot of big leaf area and material on them, but also a lot of fuzzy material on those leaves as well as the stem. Can you kind of talk a little bit about those structures, and could that deter our animals from wanting to graze them voluntarily?
In some cases, yes, that fuzzy material on the leaf, that is just leaf hairs. We call it pubescence. And some animals may find that less appetizing. If they're not used to plants that have some natural pubescence on them, it may be off-putting. They may need some time to adjust to that furry leaf before really enjoying the benefits of that forage. We have another one coming up with a pubescent leaf as well, but they didn't seem deterred by that at all in this case. But it does take some acclimation time if your animals aren't used to that type of texture on the leaves.
I would agree, Christine. And again, we didn't do a study on it, but as we were evaluating and looking at these ewes as they were kind of going back and forth on what they were choosing to eat first all the way to last, our soybeans, unfortunately, were one of the last that were consumed. But once we had those animals in that area and kind of forced them to eat it down, they certainly began to enjoy them as well.
Starting to get to the end of our plots here, Brady. Our next one is barley, a popular small grain, also a forage.
Also, forage, Christine, and one word that we used all day during Sheep Day to describe this forage was rocket fuel. And the reason for that being that crude protein value. Out of all of our forages that we planted, it had the highest crude protein value at nearly 33.5%. So a really nice forage for us to grow, a very popular forage for us. And not only from a forage aspect, we can grow it for grain. There's a lot of barley pop being produced here in the state as well. So also a really nice forage for that.
In our next plot is another small grain, and this one would be winter rye, cereal rye. Some of the things we saw with our barley and also our rye were that they weren't quite as high yielding as some of the other crops. And that could be due to the planting date. These typically are going to be best planted in the middle of September. Often they're planted all the way into November as a cover crop after corn. And so what we probably saw was a bit higher than ideal growth temperature for these small grains at the time that our demo plot was going on, and probably would have been better off had we waited about 30 days to seed these ones. But again, our cereal rye did very well. It's high quality forage, provides good amounts of fiber, excellent crude protein as well in the immature stage. Something you want to watch with your small grains, as with all other grasses, is at the point that they do begin to develop their seed head, that fiber accumulation goes up, crude protein goes down because the majority of the nutrition is then going to be found in the seed head. And so if you're grazing small grains, the ideal time to get those off is before or right during early boot stage. As we get to the end of our plots, this is one we spent quite a bit of time in because it was very pleasant both for the people and for the animals, and that was sunflower.
Definitely, Christine. An unconventional forage when we talk about feeding livestock or even a cover crop all the way to our forage plots for our wildlife species, but one that our sheep tended to really enjoy and to be in a lot as well. At the time of us grazing these forage or during the demonstration, we had the flowers beginning to form, kind of had that pod at the top. There were a couple flowers that began to bloom, but the specific sunflower that we're using is a variety known for seed production for oil at the end of the day. But what was really interesting is to watch these sheep and see how they began to graze on these sunflowers. They were anywhere from 2 to probably 3.5 feet in terms of height, and those ewes would kind of circle around that patch of sunflowers. And as they began to circle it, they began to strip leaves off of those. So they were eating those leaves first, and they actually really enjoyed that flower head that had not bloomed yet. As we busted one of those open, it had a lot of pithy type of material. It didn't have any seeds forming in it yet, but they really enjoyed that. And then after they got that top bit off, they kind of just chomped that stalk all the way down to the ground. There were a couple instances where we saw ewes kind of walking around with a long stem with a taproot hanging out their mouth, and as soon as they got to the taproot, they kind of cut it off there and spit the rest of it out. But again, one that we were really pleasantly surprised with, and one that actually has a lot of good quality parameters associated with it as well. And Christine, if nothing else, you can take some nice pictures in these forages here after they bloom throughout the fall activities.
Definitely. So you can incorporate that agro-tourism aspect as well and still have a crop that's grazable. The best time for quality, as with most crops, sunflowers included, is right at bloom or pre-bloom. But I'm sure that they would enjoy that leaf material slightly after as well. So maybe you can get two birds with one stone, maybe even three, since they're typically grown for seed and attracted to birds as well. All encompassing there with those sunflowers. That was fun to try. Sunflowers are much more common further west, further into the Midwest, Dakotas, Nebraska, where a lot of sunflower oil is produced. And in those cases, they often use sunflower as a silage crop. A bit lower quality than corn silage, but still very nice additive for a lot of feedlots in those areas. And we saw that they were definitely preferred as well in our plots. We hope that you've enjoyed this virtual forage demo plot walk and learning some more about the various annuals that are available, can be successfully grown and eaten here in the state of Ohio, help you fill some of those forage gaps in your system, extend your grazing season. And if you ever have any questions about different types of forages you may be considering, please feel free to reach out to us. If you're just interested in forages in general or looking at a specific class of livestock, Extension has staff available to help you make the best decision for your farm. Brady, thank you so much for your time on the show today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Christine. I had a lot of fun with the field day, and we hope that you guys enjoyed it as well.
We'll see you next time for our next edition of Forage Focus.